it is difficult. It's hard to explain to, a 5 and a 6, nearly 7-year-old what's going on.
She's very doting on the children and likes to keep an eye, particularly Charlotte.
The morning light filtered through the tall windows of a private residence in Berkshire, casting long shadows across a room where Pippa Middleton sat with her hands folded, her expression composed, yet visibly troubled. For years she had maintained an almost monastic silence about her sister's life within the palace walls. The world knew her as the woman who walked behind Catherine at Westminster Abbey, elegant in white, capturing global attention with a single moment. But today, that silence would shatter. The decision to speak had not come easily. Those close to Pippa described weeks of careful deliberation, conversations with trusted advisors, and sleepless nights weighing the consequences of breaking royal protocol. The Middleton family had always prided itself on discretion, on understanding that their proximity to the crown demanded a particular kind of restraint. Yet something had shifted in recent months, something that made continued silence feel not like loyalty but complicity. Catherine's situation had become increasingly difficult to ignore. While official statements spoke of planned procedures and recovery timelines, those within the innermost circle witnessed a different reality. The Princess of Wales, always so composed in public, was navigating challenges that went far beyond what any medical bulletin could adequately convey. The weight of expectation, the relentless scrutiny, the pressure to maintain an image of perfection while managing genuine vulnerability, had created a pressure cooker environment that even the strongest person would struggle to endure. Pippa had watched her sister transform over the years, from the carefree girl she grew up with in Bucklebury to a woman carrying the hopes and judgments of millions. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. Where Catherine once moved through the world with relative ease, she now calculated every gesture, every word, every appearance. The spontaneity that had characterized their childhood together had been systematically stripped away, replaced by the careful choreography required of future queens. The breaking point came during a private visit that had not appeared on any official schedule. Pippa arrived at Adelaide Cottage on a gray afternoon in late winter, ostensibly for tea. What she found there troubled her deeply. Catherine looked exhausted in a way that transcended physical tiredness. There was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of battles fought behind closed doors, of trying to protect her children from the chaos while managing her own challenges, of maintaining dignity while feeling increasingly isolated. They spoke for hours that day, two sisters reconnecting away from cameras and courtiers. Catherine described the peculiar loneliness of her position, how even surrounded by staff and family, she often felt profoundly alone. The expectations were impossible to fully articulate to those who had not lived them. Every decision scrutinized, every choice debated by strangers, every moment of authenticity carefully managed lest it be misinterpreted or weaponized. The support system, while present, operated within strict hierarchies and protocols that sometimes felt more constraining than comforting. What emerged from that conversation was a portrait of institutional strain. The palace machinery, designed to protect and project, had in some ways become part of the problem. Communications were controlled to the point of suffocation. Natural human responses to stress were reframed as potential PR crises. The woman at the center of it all was expected to be simultaneously vulnerable enough to seem relatable, yet strong enough to embody continuity and stability. It was an impossible balance, and Catherine was bearing the cost. Pippa left that meeting with a sense of profound unease. She had always known that royal life came with sacrifices, but seeing her sister navigate this particular moment crystallized something important. The institution was asking Catherine to be superhuman, while treating her health challenges as matters of state security, rather than personal struggles deserving of compassion and privacy. The disconnect between the public messaging and the private reality had grown too wide to ignore. In the days that followed, Pippa consulted with her husband James Matthews, with her parents Carol and Michael, and with a few trusted confidants outside the family circle. Everyone understood the gravity of what she was considering. Speaking publicly about royal matters was simply not done, especially not by family members who had so carefully maintained their distance from controversy. But everyone also understood that remaining silent might mean watching Catherine continue to struggle under impossible conditions without anyone in a position to help being willing to name the problem clearly. The final decision came after another conversation with Catherine herself, one where the Princess of Wales acknowledged that perhaps the truth needed daylight. Not salacious details or private medical information, but the broader truth about what the modern monarchy was asking of the people within it. Catherine had always been the dutiful one, the one who colored inside every line and exceeded every expectation. Perhaps, she suggested to her sister, it was time for someone to say that the lines themselves needed redrawing. News of Pippa's intention to speak spread through palace corridors with remarkable speed. By late afternoon on the day before her planned statement, senior aides were in emergency meetings. The situation required delicate handling. Unlike dealing with external critics or tabloid speculation, this was family, someone with intimate knowledge and, crucially, someone the public generally viewed favorably. Any response would need to balance institutional authority with acknowledgement that this was not an attack from a hostile source. The tension within Kensington Palace reached levels not seen since the darkest days of earlier controversies. Staff members who had weathered previous storms found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Pippa Middleton was not a disgruntled former employee or a distant relative seeking attention. She was Catherine's sister, someone who had attended every major milestone, someone whose discretion had been exemplary for over a decade. Her decision to speak publicly carried weight precisely because it was so uncharacteristic. Communications teams drafted and redrafted possible responses. Some advocated for a firm statement reiterating that family matters should remain private. Others suggested a softer approach, acknowledging the complexity of the situation while maintaining institutional dignity. A few voices argued for simply saying nothing, letting Pippa's statement stand without official response. Each option carried risks, and the clock was ticking toward the moment when Pippa would step before cameras. Behind the scenes, attempts were made to reach Pippa directly. Messages came through various channels, some official, some unofficial. The tone varied from gently concerned to subtly warning. There were reminders of precedent, of how speaking publicly about royal matters had historically been handled, of the potential consequences for everyone involved. But Pippa remained resolute. She had made her decision not impulsively but after careful thought, and she intended to follow through. Prince William found himself in a particularly difficult position. His loyalty to his wife was absolute, but he also understood the institutional pressures and protocols that governed their lives. He had grown up within this system, had watched his own mother struggle against its constraints, and had hoped that lessons had been learned. Now, facing his sister-in-law's decision to speak publicly, he was forced to confront whether those lessons had truly been absorbed or merely given lip service. The prince held a private conversation with Pippa 2 days before her statement. No aides were present, no minutes were taken. What was said between them remains known only to the two people in that room, but those who saw William afterwards noted a certain resignation in his manner, a sense that he understood why this was happening even if he wished circumstances were different. He emerged from that conversation not angry but thoughtful, perhaps recognizing that Pippa's actions stemmed from love and concern rather than any desire to cause harm. Catherine herself remained largely removed from the crisis management discussions. Her focus was on her recovery and her children, on maintaining as much normalcy as possible within an inherently abnormal situation. But she was aware of the storm brewing around her sister's decision, and those close to her reported that she felt a complex mixture of emotions. gratitude that someone was willing to speak uncomfortable truths on her behalf, anxiety about the potential fallout, relief that perhaps the conversation might finally shift in a more constructive direction. The king was briefed on the situation during his regular evening meeting with his private secretary. His response was measured. He had tremendous respect for Catherine and was deeply concerned about her well-being. He also understood that the institution needed to evolve, that public expectations had shifted, and that managing royal life in the modern era required different approaches than in previous generations. His instruction to his staff was clear. Handle this with sensitivity. Remember that family comes first, and avoid any response that would escalate the situation or make Catherine's position more difficult. As the hours counted down, the media began picking up whispers that something significant was about to happen. Royal correspondents traded theories and rumors. Social media churned with speculation. The palace remained officially silent, but the undercurrent of tension was palpable to anyone paying attention. This was not a manufactured controversy or tabloid invention. This was something real, something that spoke to fundamental questions about how the royal family functioned behind its carefully maintained facade. The evening before Pippa's statement, a small dinner was held at the Middleton family home in Berkshire. Present were Pippa, her husband James, her parents Carol and Michael, and her brother James. Catherine was not in attendance, but she was very much present in spirit and in their thoughts. They discussed not just the statement itself, but what they hoped it might accomplish. Not drama for its own sake, not personal vindication, but perhaps a catalyst for necessary conversations about support, mental health, and the human cost of public service. Carol Middleton, who had always been fiercely protective of both her daughters, expressed what many in the room were feeling. She had watched Catherine navigate impossible situations with grace and dignity for years. She had seen her daughter criticized for being too common, then too perfect, then too careful, then too distant. She had watched as health challenges were treated as state secrets rather than human experiences, deserving of compassion. Enough was enough. If speaking truthfully meant risking disapproval from some quarters, so be it. Some things mattered more than approval. The morning arrived cool and overcast, fitting weather for what was about to unfold. Pippa had chosen to make her statement from a neutral location, not her home or any venue with royal associations. She wanted this to be clearly her own voice, her own choice, free from any appearance of institutional pressure or approval. The room was simple, dignified, with natural light and minimal staging. This was not a performance. It was unburdening. She began by acknowledging the unusual nature of what she was doing. For over a decade, she had maintained privacy about her sister's royal life, believing that discretion was both appropriate and necessary. But circumstances had led her to conclude that continued silence would serve no one, least of all Catherine. What followed was not an attack on the institution or a revelation of secrets, but rather a carefully worded expression of concern about the environment in which her sister was trying to recover and fulfill her duties. Pippa spoke about the immense pressure Catherine had faced even before her recent health challenges. The constant scrutiny, the impossible standards, the way every aspect of her appearance and behavior was analyzed and criticized. She described how her sister had always tried to meet every expectation, to be perfect in a role that demanded perfection, while also demanding relatability. The contradiction was exhausting, and the support systems in place were not always adequate to the scale of the challenge. The statement carefully avoided specific medical details or private family information. Instead, Pippa focused on broader themes: the need for mental health support at the highest levels, the importance of allowing people in public life to be genuinely human, the ways that institutional protocols sometimes created additional stress rather than alleviating it. She spoke about watching her sister struggle to balance recovery with royal duty, to protect her children while managing public expectations, to maintain her own well-being while serving an institution that sometimes seemed more concerned with image than individual welfare. What made the statement so powerful was its restraint. Pippa did not rage or accuse. She did not name specific individuals or incidents. Instead, she spoke with evident sadness about a system that meant well but often fell short, about people trying their best within constraints that perhaps needed reconsidering. She expressed hope that her speaking out might contribute to positive change, might help create an environment where Catherine and others in similar positions could receive the support they needed without fear that showing vulnerability would be seen as weakness or failure. The reaction was immediate and intense. Social media exploded with responses ranging from support to criticism to shock that someone so consistently private had chosen to speak. News organizations scrambled to analyze every word, to place the statement in historical context, to speculate about implications for the royal family. Royal commentators appeared on television, offering interpretations that varied wildly depending on their particular perspectives and allegiances. Public response was notably different from media response. Many people, particularly those who had followed Catherine's journey from commoner to princess to future queen, expressed sympathy and understanding. They recognized in Pippa's words an echo of their own concerns about the toll that public life was taking on someone they had come to admire. The outpouring of support was substantial, with thousands sharing their own stories of family members facing health challenges, of the importance of having advocates willing to speak up, of gratitude that someone close to Catherine was willing to name truths that had been obvious to careful observers. Within the palace, the response was more complicated. There was genuine appreciation among some staff members for Pippa's measured approach and her obvious concern for Catherine's well-being. Others felt defensive, worried that the statement would be interpreted as an indictment of everyone working within the institution. Still others recognized that regardless of intentions, the statement had created a moment that would require careful navigation. The question was not whether to respond, but how to respond in a way that acknowledged legitimate concerns while maintaining institutional stability. Catherine herself reportedly learned of the specific contents of Pippa's statement at the same time as the general public. The decision to keep her somewhat distanced from the final details was intentional, designed to protect her from being seen as orchestrating criticism of the institution she served. But those who spoke with her afterwards described a woman who felt both relieved and apprehensive. Relieved that the truth was finally being spoken, apprehensive about the consequences for everyone involved, especially her sister who had taken such a risk on her behalf. Prince William's response came not in an official statement, but in actions. He cleared his schedule for the afternoon and spent several hours with Catherine and their children, prioritizing family over public appearances. The message was subtle but clear. Whatever institutional complications might arise from Pippa's statement, his primary concern was for his wife's well-being. Later, through unofficial channels, word spread that William supported the broader goals of Pippa's statement, even if he might have chosen different timing or methods. The international media picked up the story with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. Some framed it as a family in crisis, others as a brave stand against institutional pressure, still others as evidence of deeper problems within the monarchy itself. The truth, as usual, was more nuanced than any single headline could capture. This was about specific people in specific circumstances trying to navigate extraordinarily difficult situations with limited roadmaps and intense public scrutiny. To understand why Pippa's statement resonated so deeply, one must understand what had been unfolding behind the carefully managed public facade. The past year had been extraordinarily challenging for Catherine in ways that went beyond her health situation. She had been navigating not just physical recovery but the complex emotional and psychological landscape of being a public figure trying to maintain privacy around deeply personal matters. The announcement of her health situation in January had been carefully crafted to provide information while protecting details. But the aftermath proved more difficult to manage than anticipated. Speculation ran rampant despite the clarity of official statements. Every absence was analyzed, every photograph scrutinized for hidden meanings. The conspiracy theories that emerged were painful not just because they were false, but because they revealed how little privacy remained, even in matters of health. Catherine found herself in the bizarre position of having to prove she was managing a serious situation rather than being trusted to handle it privately. The children had been her primary concern throughout. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were at ages where they understood that something was different, but could not fully grasp why their mother's situation had become global news. Protecting them from the worst of the speculation and commentary while being honest about what was happening required constant vigilance. Catherine and William had worked hard to maintain routine and normalcy at home, but the pressure of public curiosity inevitably seeped into their private world. What many outside observers failed to understand was the particular loneliness of Catherine's position. She was surrounded by people yet often felt isolated. Staff were professional and caring, but ultimately employees operating within defined roles. Friends were supportive but careful about boundaries given her royal status. Even family had to navigate the complex protocols and sensitivities of her position. The very factors that protected her in some ways created distance in others. The institutional response to her situation had been well-intentioned but sometimes missed the mark. There was abundant concern for how her health affected her public duties, less apparent recognition of the emotional toll of having those duties suspended, and knowing that millions were speculating about every detail. There were systems in place for managing communications and schedules, fewer systems for managing the psychological impact of being a person whose illness became a matter of state interest rather than private concern. Pippa had witnessed this firsthand during her visits. She saw how Catherine would sometimes retreat into a kind of formal mode, even with family, as if the demands of her role had become so ingrained that letting go completely felt dangerous. She noticed how conversations about feelings or struggles were often quickly redirected to practical matters, logistics, and next steps. There was action, but sometimes less space for simply acknowledging how difficult things were without immediately trying to solve or manage them. The medical aspects of Catherine's situation were being handled by excellent professionals, but the holistic support for her as a whole person navigating extraordinary circumstances felt less robust. This was not anyone's fault exactly. The systems in place had evolved over generations to handle royal life as it had traditionally been lived. But modern understanding of mental health, stress, and trauma required different approaches. The institution was trying to adapt, but institutional change moved slowly, while individual needs existed in real time. One particular challenge was the tension between Catherine's own instincts about what she needed and institutional advice about what was best for the monarchy. She wanted to be more open, to connect more authentically with people, to acknowledge struggles rather than maintaining an impenetrable facade of perfection. But she was cautioned that too much openness might diminish the mystique that some believed essential to royal effectiveness, or that showing vulnerability might be weaponized by critics. The balance was elusive and exhausting to navigate. There were also practical frustrations. Simple things that ordinary people took for granted became complicated when filtered through security protocols and PR considerations. A desire to just talk to a friend without it becoming public knowledge required careful management. A need for space and quiet had to be balanced against duties and expectations. Even recovery, which should have been a private healing process, became something that required strategic communication and careful timing around public appearances. What Pippa understood, and what drove her to speak, was that her sister was not just managing a health challenge, but was doing so while carrying the weight of an institution's expectations, the public's curiosity, and her own high standards for duty and service. It was too much for anyone to carry alone, and yet the structures designed to support her sometimes added to, rather than alleviated, the burden. Something needed to change, not just for Catherine, but for anyone who would occupy similar positions in the future. The financial and resource aspects were also more complex than outsiders realized. While the royal family obviously had access to excellent medical care and support services, there were limitations on what could be accessed outside official channels without creating security concerns or potential PR complications. Mental health support, for instance, required finding professionals who could be trusted with absolute discretion, who understood the unique pressures of royal life, and who could provide care without it becoming public knowledge. The pool of such professionals was limited, and accessing them required navigating institutional approval processes that added time and complexity. In the days following Pippa's statement, something unexpected happened. Rather than the divisive controversy many had anticipated, a more constructive conversation began to emerge. Royal commentators who had spent years defending every institutional decision found themselves acknowledging that perhaps reforms were needed. Critics who had been harsh about the monarchy's relevance recognized that the people within it were struggling with very human challenges. The conversation shifted from blame to possibility. The palace's official response, when it finally came, was notably measured. Rather than dismissing Pippa's concerns or circling wagons, the statement acknowledged the complexity of supporting family members in public roles and expressed commitment to ensuring that well-being remained paramount. It was not an admission of failure, but rather an acknowledgement that continuous improvement was necessary. The tone suggested that Pippa's statement had been received not as an attack, but as a difficult but valuable contribution to necessary conversations. Catherine herself made a brief appearance at a small private event shortly after, looking composed but noticeably moved by the support that had emerged following her sister's statement. She did not address the situation directly, but those present reported that she seemed lighter somehow, as if a burden of silence had been at least partially lifted. The understanding that people recognized the challenges she faced, that they cared about her as a person beyond her role, appeared to provide genuine comfort. The broader royal family responded with notable unity. King Charles made a point of visiting Catherine and spending time with his grandchildren, a gesture that spoke volumes about priorities. Other family members quietly expressed support through their actions, ensuring that Catherine knew she was not isolated despite the scrutiny. The message was clear. Regardless of institutional complications, family loyalty remained paramount. What emerged in subsequent weeks was a more open acknowledgement of the challenges inherent in modern royal life. Mental health resources were quietly expanded. Protocols around privacy and medical matters were reviewed. Conversations began about how to better support family members navigating the impossible balance between public duty and private struggles. None of this happened dramatically or overnight, but the direction of travel had shifted. Pippa herself largely retreated from public view after her statement, having said what she felt needed saying. She received both criticism for breaking protocol and praise for her courage, but she maintained that her motivation had been singular: concern for her sister. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental truth. In private conversations with friends, she expressed hope that her speaking out might contribute to positive changes, while acknowledging the personal cost of having broken years of careful silence. The relationship between Catherine and Pippa, if anything, deepened. The sisters had always been close, but Pippa's willingness to risk disapproval and criticism to advocate for Catherine created a new level of trust and understanding. They spoke more frequently, with greater openness about struggles and fears. Catherine expressed gratitude not just for the public statement, but for the years of private support that had preceded it. The countless moments when Pippa had been simply a sister rather than a princess's sibling. For the institution itself, the episode became a catalyst for deeper reflection. Senior advisors began examining how support systems could be strengthened, how protocols could be made more flexible without compromising necessary security and privacy protections, and how the human needs of family members could be better balanced against institutional requirements. It was not about abandoning tradition, but about ensuring that tradition served people rather than the reverse. Public perception of Catherine shifted in subtle but meaningful ways. Where she had often been discussed in terms of fashion choices or royal duties, now there was greater recognition of her as a person navigating genuine challenges with grace and courage. The speculation and conspiracy theories that had flourished earlier gave way to a more respectful understanding that privacy in difficult moments was not suspicious, but simply human. The relationship between the public and the princess matured in important ways. Looking forward, the question became whether this moment would lead to lasting change or prove merely a temporary shift in tone. Early signs were cautiously encouraging. Conversations about mental health in royal contexts continued beyond the initial news cycle. Other family members began speaking more openly about their own challenges. The institution demonstrated willingness to examine its practices and adapt where necessary. But true transformation would require sustained effort and commitment. For Catherine, the path remained challenging, but perhaps slightly clearer. She continued her recovery with the knowledge that those closest to her were willing to speak difficult truths on her behalf, that the public largely supported her need for privacy and healing, and that the institution was at least beginning to grapple with how to better support its members. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was not walking it entirely alone. The legacy of Pippa's statement would ultimately depend on what happened next. Had it been merely a moment of drama that would fade into royal history as a footnote, or had it genuinely opened doors to necessary evolution in how the monarchy functioned? Only time would tell, but in the immediate aftermath, there was a sense that something had shifted, that a conversation too long deferred had finally begun, that the silence that had protected some things while perpetuating others had been broken in ways that might prove ultimately beneficial. The truth behind palace walls is rarely simple, often painful, and always deeply human. What we have witnessed is not scandal, but rather the courage of families standing firm when silence becomes too costly. Subscribe to follow this continuing story as it unfolds.